Good evening. By the grace of God, we have assembled here, although virtually, to share our views. Today's topic of discussion is emancipation of women, the pioneers and pathfinders. To me, the greatest source of inspiration is the rural lady who paved the way to women's independence and an iconic woman who lived ahead of her time. This lady with the lamp transcends us to a sublime height. This wonder lady is Rashundari Devi, who writes her own chronicle of life. The title of my paper is The Caged Bird Sings, Memoirs of a Jeetakshara Lady, an Invincible Soul. Rashundari Devi is among the earliest women writers in Bengali literature. Her autobiography, Amar Jibon, is known as the first published autobiography in Bengali language. Rashundari Devi was born in the year 1809. This was the time when Ram Mohan Rai was yet to arrive in Kolkata. Debendranath Thakur and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar were not yet born. Rashundari Devi lived in times when social reform had barely touched the lives of upper caste women in India. Education was unimaginable for women, and a literate woman was synonymous with a wicked or cursed woman. But she refused to remain an unlettered woman all her life. She taught herself to read and write and constructed for herself an identity independent of her husband and children. She not only earned literacy by sheer dedication and hard work, but also used it for self-discovery. By her deeds and actions, she was endowed with the title Jeetakshara. The most authentic source to know about her life is her own autobiography, in which she has recorded all the major events of her life. Rashundari Devi was born to a rural zamindar family in the small village of Potajia in Pabna in 1809. She lost her father when she was only a small child. She was raised by her widowed mother, with whom she developed a lifelong, deep emotional attachment. Her mother was a religious woman who taught her to remember God in good and bad times. Rashundari's writing is full of references to her mother and to God, both functioning as a significant other in structuring her thoughts and actions. Rashundari was married at the age of 12 to a man who belonged to a well-to-do landed household in Rajbari, Faridpur. The marriage took her to the far-off village of Ramdia, where, as she mentions in her autobiography, people were kind and caring enough. Still, the grief of separation from her beloved mother, and that too at such a tender age, was too much to overcome, and she would cry all the time. A Vaishnavite like her husband and his family, Rashundari was deeply religious. Her firm faith in God's grace, along with her invincible willpower, helped her carry on in all the challenges of life and times. At the age of 14, Rashundari faced no choice but to assume responsibility of the entire household as a mother-in-law had lost her eyesight and became bedridden. She now had to do all the housework, from cleaning to cooking to attending to guests and looking after to everyone's comfort. The family was a large one, and the servants were not allowed to enter the premises of the house. Her workload increased as she became mother at the age of 18. She bore 12 children, of whom one died early. Unassisted and confined to Antapur of the house, Rashundari kept performing her domestic duties, but felt a strange desire for something she knew was forbidden to her: the desire to gain literacy. The desire to be able to read Chaitanya Bhagavat on her own. One day, her husband left his Chaitanya Bhagavat in the kitchen before going out. Rashundari gathered courage, detached a page from the book, and hid it in the kuri of the kitchen. Then she stole one of the palm leaves on which her son practiced handwriting. By comparing the words written on the 2 pages and with people's speech, by recollection and recognition of the letters she had learned in childhood, by constant effort and determination, Rashundari taught herself to read at the age of 26. She learned to write years later, when her son expressed his annoyance about her not answering his letters. A few months after her husband's death, at the age of 59, she finished and published the first version of her autobiography, Amar Jibon, in 1868. A final version was published in 1897. Amar Jibon was written and published in 2 parts. The first part consisted of 16 rachanas or compositions. The second part came out in the year 1906, consisting of 15 rachanas or compositions. Every composition is preceded by a devotional poem dedicated to her Daya Madhu. Daya Madhu, the Vaishnav godhead whom Rashundari Devi had chosen. Written in chaste Bangla, Amar Jibon narrates the life story of 19th century woman's struggle for literacy. It portrays the changing world of rural Bengal and situates women there. Rashundari has narrated her life story in 2 ways. On the one hand, she writes that God's mercy and benevolence towards her has made it possible to achieve literacy. On the other hand, she also shows how she has made her own decisions in life by learning to read despite the fear of family disapproval and social ostracism. She praises God's Leela, but also recounts all the hard work and self-determination she has asserted to learn reading. Rashundari Devi's life is a series of actions and decisions that are serious departures from the patriarchal social norms of a time and are therefore transgressions punishable by society. Rashundari Devi learned to read and write amidst the popular belief in those days that women who gained literacy brought disaster upon their families and were punished by God with widowhood. Not only did she learn to read, but also she decided to record the events and details of her everyday domestic life in a book and got it published. She had the audacity to disclose her life in print. By doing this, she entered the public sphere, which was strictly forbidden to upper class Hindu women. A published work no longer remains a private act of writing, but enters the public domain, where it is open and available for perusal and interrogation by anyone. So, there are three major transgressions that Rashundari Devi commits according to patriarchy: reading, writing, and entering the public sphere. Rashundari also made a notable departure from the common patriarchal belief that female worship can only be expressed in the form of rituals like fasts, penance, and cooking vogue, food for God. Rashundari rejected these conventional, ritualistic forms of women's devotion that served in maintaining the patriarchal social structures, and established an intellectual relationship with her God by learning to read Chaitanya Bhagavat. She chose to engage in a kind of worship where she is an active participant like her husband and other men, not a passive devotee. Rashundari Devi, in her writing, demystifies the figure of the Griholakshi by presenting her domestic duties as laborious work, which is tiresome, repetitive, unrecognized, and far from emotionally fulfilling. Her assertion that, I quote, "I did everything in the spirit of duty," unquote, is indicative of her emotional detachment from her household work. She also demystifies the nurturing of maternal figure by describing her work of feeding and looking after children as physically laborious. In this manner, Rashundari's life writing contests the male representation of women in literature. উদ্ধৃতি, একটি সন্তান পালন করিতে মায়ের যে কত প্রকার যাতনা আর কষ্ট সহ্য করিতে হয় তাহা তো তোমার প্রসাদে আমি বিলক্ষণ জানিয়াছি। ছেলের জন্য মায়ের যে এত যন্ত্রণা ভোগ করিতে হয় ইহা আমি পূর্বে জানিতাম না। নিজের উপর চাপ না পড়িলে লোকে বিশেষ মতে জানিতে পারে না। ফলত সন্তানের জন্য মায়ের যে কত দূর যন্ত্রণা ভোগ করিতে হয় সেটা আমি বিলক্ষণ বুঝিতে পারিয়াছি। মনুষ্য মাত্রেরই এ বিষয়ে ভালো মতো জানা আবশ্যক। উদ্ধৃতি শেষ। Rashundari Devi's autobiography is a testimony of the odds against education of women in her generation. After describing all the steps she took to gain literacy, including the stilling of pages and palm leaves, she writes, উদ্ধৃতি, আহা কি আক্ষেপের বিষয়, মেয়ে ছেলে বলিয়া কি এতই দুর্দশা, চোরের মতো যেন বন্দী হইয়াই থাকি, তাই বলিয়া কি বিদ্যা শিক্ষাতেও দোষ? সে যাহা হোক, এখনকার মেয়ে ছেলেগুলো যে নিষ্কণ্টক স্বাধীনতায় আছে তাহা দেখিয়াও মন সন্তুষ্ট হয়। এখন যাহার একটি মেয়ে ছেলে আছে সে কত যত্ন করিয়া লেখাপড়া শেখায়। এই লেখাপড়া শিখিবার জন্য আমাদের কত কষ্ট হইয়াছে। আমি যে যৎকিঞ্চিৎ শিখিয়াছি সে কেবল সম্পূর্ণ পরমেশ্বরের অনুগ্রহে মাত্র। উদ্ধৃতি শেষ। Child marriage and the deep scar that it left on its young victims had probably never had a better spokesperson than Rashundari. Rashundari describes her child marriage and the agony of separation from her mother thus, open quotes, "If I am asked to describe my state of mind, I would say it was very much like the sacrificial goat being dragged to the altar. The same hopeless situation, the same agonized scream." The end of quotation. She adds, I quote, "People put birds in cages for their own amusement. Well, I was like a caged bird, and I would have to remain in this cage for life." Unquote. এমন যে দুর্লভ বস্তু মা, এই মায়ের সেবা করিতে পারি নাই। আহা, আমারে দুঃখ রাখিবার স্থান আছে? আমি যদি পুত্র সন্তান হইতাম আর মার আসন্নকালের সংবাদ পাইতাম, তবে আমি যেখানে থাকিতাম পাখির মতো উড়িয়া যাইতাম। কি করিব, আমি পিঞ্জরবদ্ধ বিহঙ্গী। উদ্ধৃতি শেষ। In fact, the metaphor of a bird being caged is quite dominant in Rashsundari's autobiography. She saw herself as a prisoner of marriage, from where she wished to break free and transcend her worldly duties as a wife, mother, and daughter-in-law to meet her God. উদ্ধৃতি, লোকে আমোদ করিয়া পাখি পিঞ্জরে বদ্ধ করিয়া রাখিয়া থাকে, আমার যেন সেই দশা ঘটিয়াছে। আমি ওই পিঞ্জরে এ জন্মের মতো বন্দী হইলাম, আমার জীবদ্দশাতে আর মুক্তি নাই। উদ্ধৃতি শেষ। Rashsundari Devi has described her experiences of pregnancy and childbirth in a very detailed and frank manner at a time when they were considered taboo topics for women to speak. Writing about her pregnancy and sharing it with the public by publishing is certainly a very feminist thing to do. Rashsundari, while writing about the hardships she had to face as a child bride and the risks she had to take to gain literacy, rejoices in the fact that the times are changing and some parents have started educating their daughters. Rashsundari Devi is definitely an advocate of women's right to education, though she doesn't mention it in her autobiography. Rashsundari writes her own life story, which is apparently colorless and monotonous. But she had invincible willpower and self-confidence to write this autobiography. She voices a strong protest against the terrible suffering at her and heart-rending mental agony of women of the existing society of her time. She concludes her autobiography with an appeal to her readers. উদ্ধৃতি, এই বইখানি আমার নিজ হস্তে লেখা। আমি লেখাপড়া কিছুই জানি না। পাঠক মহাশয়েরা, তোমরা যেন অবহেলা না করো, দেখিয়া ঘৃণা করিও না, অধিক লেখা বাহুল্য। উদ্ধৃতি শেষ। Rashsundari Devi's life story is an inspiration and testimony of a woman's willpower to fight all odds to gain education and liberation. I conclude this paper by quoting Maya Angelou's poem, "I know why the caged bird sings." The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. I cordially thank our dear Secretary and Principal Professor Ajanta Pal and the convener and NAC coordinator Dr. Nabonita Mitro for giving me an opportunity to share my views. I thank our dear Shagorika Di from the bottom of my heart for her gracious presence. My sincere and warm wishes to our guest speaker, Professor Bonita Elias, who is one of the pioneers of women's studies. I also earnestly thank my former colleagues and dear friends and all the participants for lending me a patient hearing. I especially thank all the students for their active participation. I earnestly request them to read this autobiography, Amar Jibon, to experience the wonderful journey of Sundari Devi. Thank you.